Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me here again today. Last week we spoke about the farm murder of Stefan Smit, and I say farm murder like that because it kind of looks like a typical farm murder that we may have in South Africa, but things kind of escalated and a whole lot of drama panned out. So if you would like to watch that video, then I will link it up here for you. But on my channel previously, we have spoken about the first female serial killer here in South Africa, and I will link that up here if you haven't seen that video. But today we are going to talk about another female killer in South Africa, but this is known as the youngest female killer to have been sentenced in South Africa. So if you have not heard the story of Marlene Lehnberg, then let's get into it.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Arthur Lehnberg and Mavis Lehnberg were a couple who had a very starry-eyed and happy and forward-looking vision of what they wanted in the future of their relationship. So because Arthur and Mavis came from extremely poor backgrounds, this starry-eyed vision and this high hopes that they had for their future kind of suffered a lot because they had no money to start off with. Both Mavis and Arthur came from extremely conservative backgrounds and very religious backgrounds. They were married young, they worked really hard, but they unfortunately could not make ends meet, and they eventually lost the house that they were living in. So Arthur's father eventually said to them, you guys are really struggling. I have a garage. I'm not using the garage. You can maybe stay here for a little bit until you get back on track and I can help you out. I'm not sure if Mavis and Arthur had to kind of pay rent to Arthur's father, but they were staying in the garage for quite a while. And by quite a while, I mean that they had 5 children together in this garage for the duration that they were staying there. But one child that we are going to focus on specifically from Arthur and Mavis is a young lady named Marlene, who was born on the 15th of October 1955. And after years and years of grafting, working hard, Mavis and Arthur eventually were able to make ends meet, and they had enough money to now put a down payment on a house. And this house was not in the suburbs of an affluent suburb or a nice area. It was really, really far out, where they hardly had any neighbors. The closest neighbors were maybe a couple 100 meters away, so they were quite isolated. But like I said earlier, Mavis and Arthur were very religious and very conservative, and this is how they raised their 5 children. And also, like I said, the children were not very well socialized. They spent a lot of time in their close-knit family. And as we spoke about Marlene earlier, that is going to be our focus of the story. And Marlene did go to school, but she ended up dropping out at around 16 years old, and which is grade 10. And the reason that Marlene dropped out of school is because she wanted more out of life. She was actually very clever and she did really well in school. She had very high grades, but this just wasn't for her. She wanted more money, she wanted more out of life than sitting behind a desk all day, which is kind of ironic when we get into what's going to happen next. But basically, a little bit after Marlene left school, which was around February 1972, she ended up getting a job as a receptionist at the Red Cross Children's Hospital, which is situated in Rondebosch, Cape Town. And Red Cross Children's Hospital was first built in 1956 as a way to kind of say thank you to all of the soldiers from South Africa and England who fought in the Second World War. So Marlene left school, like I said, and started working as a receptionist, and she worked for a man named Christian van der Linde, who was around 40 years old at the time, maybe a bit older. And Christian and Marlene had a very close bond. They were very good friends, and Christian kind of took Marlene under his wing and showed her the ropes. He showed her everything that he had learned to try and help her grow as a person. But in the very beginning, Christian and Marlene's relationship was seen as a more father-daughter kind of bond. But as Marlene grew up with very little affection from her parents, this affection that Christian was giving her was very much welcomed by Marlene, and she was loving any type of affection from Christian, in the sense of maybe him showing her how to do something, him just touching her shoulder, anything like that was very comforting and welcoming to Marlene. So like I said, it was a very much father-daughter bond, very much in the beginning of their relationship. However, as the year kind of progressed and they started getting closer, this bond kind of blurred and the line started to blur into what type of relationship this was building into. As Christian and Marlene started going to events together, they were seen by the public a lot more often, and people were kind of gossiping and saying that there's definitely something going on between the two of them. And as a side note, Christian van der Linde is married. Like I said, he's around 40 years old, he has a wife, he has children, he has a house, and now there are rumors that he may be canoodling with a younger woman. much younger. But eventually, Christine and Marlene did end up crossing lines and they did have an open affair with each other. And I'm not just saying an open affair to say that they were telling everybody. What I mean is that they would go and have their sexual relationship in public areas. So they would go into fields near the hospital and they would interact over there. Maybe this was part of the excitement that they would do it in the wilderness where people could see them potentially, or it was just being out in nature that was really stirring the loins a little bit. So the affair between Christian and Marlene lasted for about a year until things started getting complicated. Marlene really wanted this relationship to go further. She wanted to be Christian's wife. But Christian was not having it. He had a very solid relationship. He was not about to leave his wife and his children for a very young child almost. And Christian basically told Marlene that she's not much more than work flirtation and, for him to feel young again, I assume. So Marlene at first ignored this. She was not having anything that Christian was saying. She was determined that Christian and her were going to be together forever. And as Marlene kept pushing Christian kept pushing her back. And eventually Marlene started making calls to Suzanne, who was Christian's wife. She wanted to bring the affair to the attention of Suzanne so that she would now know that Christian is having an affair with her, and hopefully this would break Christian and Suzanne up. But this ended up backfiring really badly on Marlene because Christian really said, you know what, we actually can't have anything now, and the relationship is over. So a couple months later, nothing was happening. Marlene was still absolutely furious that Christian did not want her solely and completely. So in September of 1974, Marlene ended up calling Suzanne again and saying, I'm still having this affair with your husband. Please, can we meet up so we can talk about it? And at first, Suzanne was like, go away. And she hung up on Marlene. But Marlene kept persisting. And eventually, Suzanne said, okay, fine, we can meet. So a few weeks went by and October 1974 came and they ended up meeting. So basically, after Marlene and Suzanne met, they ended up talking. Marlene spilled all of the beans about her and Christian's relationship. And basically, Suzanne sat there and was like, okay, you're having the affair. This has been happening for a year and a bit. And I will let you continue to have an affair with my husband, but I am not leaving him. End of story. So Marlene was not exactly happy with this. She's like, but I'm having an affair with your husband. Why aren't you leaving him? But Suzanne was like, I don't care. You can continue to have an affair with my husband, but I'm not leaving him. I'm not leaving the world that I have become accustomed to and putting my children in this kind of bad stigma because you want to now marry my husband. Susanna said to Marlene, you can have him as a mistress, and that's it. And Marlene was obviously not happy with this. She wanted everything or nothing. And obviously Marlene left this conversation with Suzanne very unsatisfied and not happy with the outcome. And Marlene thought, okay, I clearly need another plan to try and get Christian all to myself. And the perfect plan that Marlene had was all embodied in a man named Martinez Shugu. Martinez was a patient who frequently went to Red Cross Hospital because he was a patient of Christian van der Linde. Martinez had an amputated leg and he was currently on crutches and he was waiting to get his prosthetic leg made by Christian. Red Cross Hospital is a public hospital, so people from all different walks of life all come to this hospital, and Martinez was one who needed the help of the government to get this prosthetic leg. And Marlene is watching this guy, Martinez, come in and out every couple of weeks to get his leg measured, his vitals taken, and everything just checked on him to see if he is okay and fit to get this leg. And Marlene is really studying him, watching him, getting to know him, talking to him, figuring out everything that Martinez is as a person. Marlene figured out that Martinez is impressionable, he is easily persuaded, and what was most important to Marlene was that Martinez was poor. And this was basically one of the things that Marlene used against Martinez. So eventually, after a lot of talking back and forth with Martinez, she persuaded him to meet up with her in a public place. And Martinez eventually went there, and Marlene gave him money, she gave him alcohol, and quite a lot of alcohol to be precise. She gave him a whole bottle of whiskey and I think a few other bottles of something, but basically his favorite drink was whiskey. And she kept pouring this whiskey, and eventually at the end of the night, she said to Martinez, I have this lady named Suzanne van der Linde, as Christian's wife, and I really want Christian all to myself. please, can you murder Suzanne? Just like that. So Martinez was quite taken aback by this. He was not happy at all that Marlene had asked him to murder someone. And Martinez was thinking, okay, if he does kill this Suzanne lady, then he would be hanged, because back in South Africa, the death penalty was still there and people were still being hanged. And Martinez felt so guilty about the conversation that he had with Marlene that he actually went to Suzanne van der Linde's house and he knocked on the door, and when Suzanne opened, he was just so upset and so taken aback by everything that was going through his head that he actually couldn't say anything. He just stood there, and I'm assuming that Suzanne maybe thought that he was asking for money, so she kind of didn't really give him the time of day and she just closed the door on him. Martinez then left and he went back to whatever he was trying to do, and he just tried to forget about the conversation that him and Marlene had. So maybe a week or a couple weeks later, Martinez had to go back to Christian because, like I said, he's trying to get this prosthetic leg. Martinez was in an incredible amount of pain. He was on crutches and he was not getting used to it, and he just wanted his leg. He was also trying really hard to get work, which was quite difficult when he worked more in a labor kind of field. So Marlene saw this and she kind of said to Martinez, come here, I got an offer for you. So Martinez came over and Marlene's like, you know that thing that I asked you to do the other day about killing the Suzanne lady? How about you still do it and I bump your name up to get you the prosthetic leg quicker? And at first Martinez was like, oh, but I really need the leg. But then he was like, I'm not going to murder someone for you, Marlene. And he was still upset that she kept asking him this. And Martinez left Christian's offices and he was still thinking about what Marlene had asked. And he said, okay, maybe I can go and just beat her up a little bit and maybe Marlene will be happy with that. So Martinez does go down to Suzanne van der Linde's house and he's kind of just lurking on the pavement watching her house. And Suzanne notices this guy because this is the second time now that he's been there, and Suzanne calls the police. So this all happened during apartheid South Africa in 1970s, and he was not white, so anyone lurking in a white area, no questions asked, police are there. So Suzanne calls the police come over and they beat the living daylights out of Martinez. Martinez is taken then to a public hospital and he stays there for a couple of days and then he is released. And of course, Martinez still needs his leg, so he still needs to go back to Christian's offices. So Marlene doesn't say anything because obviously she maybe felt a little bit guilty that she got Martinez beaten up. But Marlene still watches Martinez and everything that he needs. So she's watching Martinez and she realizes that Martinez is very much into porn. He loves going to pawn shops and he loves watching these kind of videos, reading those kind of magazines. And Marlene's like, okay, maybe I can get through to him this way. So Marlene approaches Martinez and she's like, I will offer you my body if you will kill this lady, Suzanne van der Linde. And Martinez is like, okay. Basically, after a little persuasion, he would now accept the job based on the fact that he would get Marlene. So now Marlene has Martinez in her grasp, basically. And while she's trying to get the plan all into action, she actually resigns from Christian's offices because she's now thinking, okay, cool. Suzanne is now going to be murdered. I'm going to have Christian all to myself. I don't need to work here anymore. I'm going to be a lady of leisure. Marlene then moves into a hostel and she meets a man who's kind of her neighbor and she sees that he has a gun. And Marlene's like, oh, can I borrow that? And the neighbor's like, no, you cannot have my gun. So magically, a couple days after Marlene asks her neighbor for this gun, the gun goes missing. Then, on the 4th of November 1974, Marlene and Martinez rock up at Suzanne van der Linde's house. Martinez then gets out of the car, walks to the front door of Suzanne's house, and rings the bell. Suzanne then opens the door, sees Martinez, who she just called the police on a couple weeks earlier, panics and runs into the house, and Martinez follows. Marlene then says that that's the last that she saw of everything that happened that day. However, Martinez has a completely different side of what happened that day. According to Martinez, he said that yes, Marlene did drop them off at Suzanne's house. However, Marlene also got out of the car. They both walked to the front door of Suzanne van der Linde's house. Marlene rang the doorbell and Suzanne opened the door. When Suzanne saw Marlene and Martinez, she knew that she was in trouble and she turned around and tried to run. However, Marlene tripped her, Suzanne fell on the floor, and Marlene then proceeded to beat Suzanne over the head with the pistol that she had taken from one of the neighbors in her hostel. Marlene then shouted to Martinez to shoot her, and she tried to hand Martinez the gun. Martinez just stood there staring at Suzanne, and he was like, I'm not going to kill her. And Marlene then panicked, and she needed to come up with another plan. Marlene then looks up from Suzanne's body on the floor, and then she sees a pair of scissors that are sitting on a table. Marlene then says to Martinez, you need to get those pair of scissors and you need to kill Suzanne now. So Martinez walks, he gets the scissors, and he stabs Suzanne in the chest 3 times. Marlene then takes the scissors and she stabs Suzanne in the chest another 3 times. But of course, Marlene denied all of this, and the two of them then drove off from Suzanne's house. But as a side note, during the trial, a nosy neighbor of Suzanne happened to walk past Marlene's car twice within a 10-minute period, and she remembers that this car was completely empty the entire time. After the murder, Marlene then drove Martinez back to retreat where he stayed, and Marlene then left Cape Town to stay in Bryanston with her uncle. Now, Christian, who was obviously Suzanne's husband, was quite concerned that Suzanne was not answering her phone, and he asked their daughter to go over to the house during her lunch break and to check if her mom was alright. So the daughter of Suzanne and Christian gets home, and she sees her mother lying in a pool of blood on the floor in their house. The daughter then proceeds to call the police, and an investigation is now done into the murder of Suzanne van der Linde. And because Martinez was lurking around the area a couple times, police were aware of this man, and they then put in a full manhunt for this lurker who was always around the area and looking at Suzanne's house. When they went into the areas, they tried to find Martinez, but they could not find him anywhere, and eventually the trail went cold for him. But eventually, after a lot of digging, police did find out about Christian's affair, which eventually linked Marlene to Christian, and they then went on the hunt for Marlene. They did find Marlene in Bryanston, and they did bring her in for questioning. After a lot of questioning, after a lot of hours in the police station, Marlene did crack, and she confessed to Martinez murdering Suzanne. For some reason, Marlene and Martinez kept in a lot of contact, so Marlene sang like a canary and let the police know exactly where Martinez was. Martinez, who was 34 at the time, and Marlene, who was 17 at the time, were both charged with the murder of Suzanne van der Linde. The trial for Marlene and Martinez took place in March of 1975, and both were found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang. But because of Marlene's age, a large appeal was done by the communities and people in the area to say that Marlene should not be sentenced to death. And eventually Marlene and Martinez were no longer given a death penalty, and Martinez was sentenced to 15 years and Marlene was then sentenced to 20 years in prison. And because of this, Marlene was then known as the youngest female to be sentenced in South Africa at 17 years old. Martinez only spent 11 years in prison and he was released. He then spent the rest of his life serving God and being a preacher for one of the churches in his community. And then one day while he was driving on the N2 in Cape Town, he was involved in a very, very tragic and fatal car accident and he was killed on scene. Marlene spent 11 years as well in Pollsmoor prison in Cape Town until she was released. By the way, Christian van der Linde, remember Marlene's lover, he would go to prison and visit Marlene once a month or every couple of weeks, and he was a very big advocate for her innocence, and he completely supported Marlene throughout this whole ordeal. But because of Christian's support for Marlene, his family did stop talking to him, his children no longer spoke to him, and he ended up being alone. And he did die alone in 1983. Then in 1986, Marlene was released, like I said, after serving 11 years. She then went on to open her own beauty salon, and she was in a long-term relationship with someone she met in prison. Then when Marlene was 59, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And then a couple days before Marlene's 60th birthday, she ended her own life. And this was in 2015. And that was the bizarre case of Marlene Lehnberg and the Scissor murder that she committed along with Martinez. But it is just such a bizarre case, and it does make me wonder, because Christian was such an advocate for Marlene's innocence, was she really obsessed with murdering Suzanne and Christian? Or was Christian maybe feeding her a little bit of information that was pushing her to actually murder Suzanne? And surely after so many attempts of trying to get Martinez to kill Suzanne, maybe you would give up. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's a different conspiracy to this whole case. But like I said, that was the case of Marlene Lehnberg. And I hope that you were entertained by it. And I will see you again next week. Bye.